That is James Mennie over at the Montreal Gazette. So, Jim, let's jump right into this poll on Quebec's sovereignty. I started talking about this very briefly with Caroline Van Vlartigan. I know CTV's got this story covered. What's going on here, do you think?
Well, it's kind of strange, Aaron, because, and I wasn't even going to touch it. However, this latest survey comes a couple of weeks after an earlier Leger survey that was conducted for the Association of Canadian Studies. And it just seems that a lot of the presumptions that we've had about the ideal of separatism in Quebec, the idea that, even though there may be a low level of public expression of support for Quebec sovereignty, it's always there, Aaron. You say the wrong word, you make the wrong move. Well, apparently, this latest poll finds that, yes, at 59%, Quebecers are the most opposed to the concept of provincial sovereignty, although the pollsters do point out that the reason it's so high is that because Quebec, with half a century of experience of banging its head against the wall over the whole issue of sovereignty, there are very few undecideds or people who don't want to answer. So in other words, the battle lines are very clearly drawn in Quebec. Support for sovereignty in Quebec remains at its usual 33%. But when you take this and you juxtapose it against a poll that came out 2 weeks ago that said 80% of Quebecers believe that they are a part of the Canadian nation, then you start asking yourself some questions. Well, what the hell's going on here? Now, I know we've had the conversation about the findings of surveys that have, suggest that most Quebecers, and not yesterday, most Quebecers over the past decade have been in favor of pipelines coming through their territory, have been in favor of buying their oil from Canada than from overseas. Of course, the political class and the chattering classes have said, no, it's not true. We don't want the dirty energy. And you really have to wonder how much of a collection of political fairy tales we're still being fed decades after perhaps the truth has been sort of exposed on these issues. How long is it going to take for someone in Quebec politics to say, listen, you know what, we're part of Canada. We should be doing our best to get the best deal, obviously, for Quebecers in Canada, the same way any other provincial government would do for its residents. But the idea of this constant state of confrontation, this apprehended state of almost political war between Quebec and Canada has got to stop. And of course, you even see it now, Aaron, where and believe me, we will see more of it, I think, once the new provincial liberal leader is chosen, how everyone's going to walk on eggshells talking about Montreal vis-a-vis the regions, talking about, Bills 96 or 21. Because why? Well, because, the rest of Quebec, they're fully in favor of this, which I think is a load of crap, to tell you the truth. I think it's been spun left, right, and center, and I really think when push comes to shove, as in so many other levels of government, Quebecers are not worried about identity or language or immigration. They're worried about their finances. They're worried about the economy. They're worried about being able to pay for their house, keeping their house, buying a house. And no matter what the generational respondents may be in a survey, that seems to be the number one issue. So it's just funny to see a couple of these polls, apparently unconnected, but sort of suggesting that maybe this portrait of perpetual conflict that, as I've described, it's a good little cottage industry in Quebec, let's face it, may not be true. It may be as how can I put it, as tangible as Frontier Town.
Any reaction from PSPP yet, or do we have to wait a couple of days?
No, are you kidding? No, this is the kind of stuff. Nobody's going to talk about this, and the same thing with the Bloc. This is, yes, if somebody asks them the question, but I'd be very surprised if the PQ decides to step up with this because they know they're in trouble, Aaron. They have a year to figure out how to sidestep this very, passionately and thoughtfully made pledge that we will hold a referendum on whether to leave Canada in our first mandate if we form the government. Do you not think a few people out there, even longtime PQ supporters, are going to sort of think twice before casting their ballot for another generation of uncertainty, for another at least 4 years of conflict, of wondering what the hell is going to happen next? I really think people have had their fill of it. So whether it's the issues of sovereignty or the usual kind of BS issues that allow politicians to sidestep the day's reality. So there's questions of identity or whatever. I really think the bottom's dropping out of that, and I think if you're a politician in Quebec and you ignore that, you're in for some big trouble.
Let's move on to, speaking of big trouble, the SAC click, that continues. The commission with Denis Gallant supervising. Jim, I'm going to get to the story that came out today. What we know in this story is what should have cost roughly $500,000 is going to end up costing over $1 billion. But now we're starting to get into the nitty-gritty, and this is where it's getting even more embarrassing, I think, for the government. So let's start with what we found out today. IT workers making $350 an hour to work on this thing after the original deal was supposed to be for about a quarter of that, and apparently done with full knowledge of where was running the show here.
Oh, yes, and apparently as well, contracts were being handed out, calls for tenders were being put together that could only be filled by companies that had connections to the guy in charge of the project. And then we find out that when those companies came on board, their wives were being hired as I guess officers of the company to, I guess, collect salaries. I mean, I don't. It's been a while since I've done a double take. I'm looking at the coverage that I saw in the press today, and I said, wait a second, no, they've taken some old testimony from the Charbonneau inquiry, and they published it. No, this is for real stuff. It's like nothing ever happened. It's like, oh no, this will never happen again. This kind of, there will be oversight and public money. My eye, this is ridiculous. And then it's not a matter of saying, gee, how could it happen that this project wound up $500 million over budget and still not finished? The real question is, why was it only $500 million? Because the bar was open, Aaron, and the doors were wide open. You could walk in there and walk out with as much as you want. And it's going to be fascinating to see what the reaction is going to be from the government of the day, from the CAC, once Judge Gallant files his report, simply because this is not a CAC-specific kind of story. You and I have talked about stuff like this going on the watch of the PQ, on the watch of the Liberals. My big question is, how entitled, how sure of yourself, how certain must you be that the fix is in, that you would turn around and do this thinking that you wouldn't get caught?
And how does it keep, let's be honest, it's Quebec. How does this keep happening over and over again?
Exactly. And who is going to turn up? Who's going to have the courage? What politician will say, no, this is ridiculous. This will not happen again. And not have a lot of laughter right in their face when they say that.
By the way, speaking of this, just as a tie-in, and I read this today in the Gazette, the Frank Zampino trial, which doesn't get a lot of coverage anymore because it's been dragging on for so many years. I think the last thing we noticed was when Gérald Tremblay had to testify and got very upset at the fact that he was somehow being tied to this. Frank Zampino, is it yesterday perhaps, testified that he basically knew nothing about this and collusion, nothing at all after the fact. It kind of reminded me for poor reference, of Sergeant Schultz on Hogan's Heroes with I Know Nothing. I read this and I'm thinking, really, this is what we've come down to so many years later, and that's the end of it?
Aaron, as I mentioned this earlier on the show, but there was a time when this was going on, when it was in the news, that Gérald Tremblay, who was still the mayor at the time, was buying spots on CJAD saying, I had no idea this was going on. I can't be everywhere. I can't be aware of everything. And a lot of people were kind of scratching their heads going, this is not a good look for their, jury. It's perhaps not the best move you made. But, and he still said the same thing all these years later. And so, of course, and Mr. Zampino is entitled to a full and complete defense, and he's saying what he is saying. And it'd be up to the prosecution to poke holes in that if they can. But this is it. This is where we are. And for me, it's the number of delays, and they were in fact legit delays. But this thing has been dragging before the court for like decades and decades, and it's kind of crazy. And like you say, it's almost like this is almost an historical case. We're looking back in the old history of Montreal. But man, oh man, it's like, listen to what we've been talking about in the past 5 minutes, and tell me how things have changed.
There you go. That's exactly it. Jim, I started the show today. We do this every now and then, asking people, instead of providing a specific topic for a question of the day, what's bugging you, or what's got your goat this week, however you want to phrase it. You got anything else, something particularly sticking out to you that's really bugging you?
Stupid weather. The stupid weather, okay?
Okay, but you can't do anything about that.
I've told you, and this has been a touchstone in my entire existence. When it's Victoria Day weekend, that's when you can stand down from you can put your winter clothes away. You don't have to worry about a blizzard coming down the pike, okay? I have to take out my winter coat twice this week, Aaron, just to go out to the shopping center, okay? So no, what's bugging? Do you think the weather's bugging me? You're damn right the weather's bugging me.
And we'll leave it at that. All right, James, have a great weekend. Thank you so much.
Buddy.